like to speak about now is go away from education some, speak about on-the-job investment and specialization. I'm actually going to do that for a few lectures. First starting out with the individual, and then looking at some kind of market equilibrium. So kind of general equilibrium outcome. So after people finish their schooling, which is what we've been speaking about, they get married, so we've handled that question. But they also go to work, and either in a household or marketplace. I'll be concentrating on the marketplace. And in school, you learn general principles, economic analysis, microeconomics, laws of physics and chemistry, whatever. And then when you get on your job, you have to take those things you learn and make them into something specific that's relevant to the job. So you may be trained as a doctor, but when you intern in order to get a practical knowledge of how to be a doctor. That's what you're doing when you're intern, right? You work in a hospital or a resident, and you see patients, and you learn how to apply the knowledge you learned in medical school to actual treatment of patients. And as an engineer, you start out, you're trained as a electrical engineer, but then you go to work in the automobile industry and helping with the electronics in a car. That's very specialized knowledge. Yes, your general knowledge as an electrical engineer can be useful, but you have to spend some time investing in special knowledge for the issues involved in cars, using computers to give all various information the car gives, including maybe telling you when there's another car in the neighborhood and warning you if you're getting too close to a car and so on. Okay. So computers increasingly being part of modern automobiles and being a crucial part of modern automobiles. And that would be true in every industry. So you take your general knowledge, you convert it into specific knowledge. That's what is sometimes called on-the-job investment or on-the-job training. Okay. And it will vary. It usually be specific to a particular industry, like automobiles, steel, or computers, or teaching, or to an occupation. Teaching it as an occupation rather than an industry. Universities is an industry, cars are an industry, software production is an industry, construction is an industry, and so on. And your skills are specific by occupation and by industry in particular. But generally, you acquire a lot of this early on in your experiences. So in early experience, you're learning a lot on the job. So after a while, though, you become specialized. So if you look at a bunch of people coming out of a college, they look similar. 20 years later, in terms of work, they're very different. Somebody may have gone into finance and is a financial analyst. Somebody else may have gone on for a PhD in psychology, so they're a psychologist. And you can keep going. PhD in psychology is additional education, but then they get additional training as a psychologist. Or if they just graduated college, one goes to be a financial analyst, the other goes to be trains more as an engineer, becomes an engineer. Somebody else works in the publishing industry. And you can go on and on. They look very different 20 years later. Because they've invested off of different trajectories. That's why they look so different. A lot of the investment occurs early on. Investment. Now, there are two models of this, where learning by doing and when there's an explicit investment required. They really don't, I'll show you, they're very similar in fundamental structure. So in one, but you automatically learn from working. It's not uncommon, so you work as an intern, you learn something. The other, you kind of take some of your time when you're working to get more specific skills, and then you have that knowledge. Okay? Now, one of the problems with dealing with investment on the job is a data problem. Now, why is that such a problem? Christina Yang, where is she? Yeah. Christina.
That's to do with selection.
With what?
Selection.
Selection? So there is selection. There's something more fundamental. If I asked you to tell me, how much training is there in the U.S. economy, aside from education, on-the-job training? Where would you go to look that up?
Maybe administrative data.
Okay, you'd go to a company, you say. Good. And what would you look at in the companies? You studied accounting, right? Not really, but well, maybe you should have. What would you look at in companies?
Maybe they had a line that said training.
What? Now, have you ever looked at a company balance sheet? Yeah. Okay. What do you know? Would you find a line that says expenditures this year on investing in my workers?
No, I don't think
No, you won't. You won't. Or if you look at the wealth of the company, you won't find a line or lines that say how much the company has invested in its workers. And the reason you don't find these lines is that companies are not required to report how much they've spent on investing in workers. They can deduct that all as labor expenses immediately, write it all off. With capital, the reason you find lines is how much I've spent on capital equipment is because I have to depreciate that capital for tax purposes over time. But for tax purposes, I can deduct all my expenditures on human capital. And so companies may have some internal books that they keep, but they don't publish those sort of books. Now maybe they should be publishing them and have a better information. How much are they, what's the rate of return on their investments? A lot of companies say they're investing a lot in their workers, but you ask them what's the rate of return, they usually don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
How would the companies even know? Because, I mean, it's one thing if you send your workers to a training seminar per week, and you can say, this is what I spent on that. But there's also, I mean, you're gonna learn more if you have certain jobs than others, even if you're doing things that are productive for the company.
Learning by doing.
Right, exactly.
All right. I was going to show you how the company would know that. Just hold that for a moment.
Okay.
Good question. But they can know that. Anything else? So the companies aren't required to keep this. If they weren't required to keep capital accounts for their plant and equipment and other investments, they would might not keep those as separate accounts either. They might do it for their own purpose or maybe not. They're required to do because they have to depreciate that over time. So they have to know how much capital do I have now? How much did I buy last period? And therefore, that means I could take off this amount this year for my taxes. They don't have to do that with human capital investment. Now, they should be keeping books on this and should be knowing what they're getting. And it's a puzzle to me why more companies don't keep internal information on that. But mostly they don't. All right, so it's hard to get that information. So economists have to be a bit of detective in this, in estimating it. Sometimes, you know, you have data in various surveys that say how much time do you spend on training, and so you have that data. People try to construct estimates from that, or companies may have some records on how much time their workers have spent that training. This could be explicit training, or it could be, you know, the workers are learning while working and they're not that efficient, so you have to try to tease that component out. And I'll show you how you can do some of that. Now, if workers paid for their training workers pay for their training. How would they do it? Well, an obvious way is they get lower wages while they're being trained. Okay? So, and what's their benefit? They get higher wages later on. So if you think of the following. Yeah, let's suppose if I didn't take any training, I would get this. So this is by age, let's say, or experience, or tenure. These are wage rates. Now, if I take training and I'm paying for it, with wage, I'll get a lower wage to start with down here. And later on, I'll get a higher wage. And whether it's a good investment depends upon the comparison of those two areas, discounted, right? So if I'm paying for my training, and the worker's paying for it, the most direct way they pay for it is by taking lower wages while they're being trained, maybe over a series of years. And in return, they get higher wages later on. That's a very simple idea, but it's very fundamental to understanding what goes on in the training market and the labor market more generally. Now, I had training occurring at younger ages. Why should that be? You don't know?
Oh, that way you have a longer period of time to.
Okay, you have a longer period of time to collect it. That would be certainly one factor, right? And if you want to become more skilled, you might as well become more skilled quicker rather than later for partly that reason. So there's more years remaining, and it may be necessary in order to work to get your skills, in order to work at various jobs, you have to get them right away. So it makes a lot of sense. Just like you get education when you're young, you get your training when you're young. Now you notice what this does is it gives a slope to your age earnings, age or experience earnings profile. You steepen it. One of the important properties if you look in labor markets is that older workers earn more than younger workers. One interpretation of that is it's because older workers have made more investment in their on-the-job training, and as a result, they're more skilled, and they are more skilled. Older workers are generally more skilled. And maybe the very old workers, their skills appreciate and their earnings go down again. And you do find that some decline in earnings at later ages. So skills depreciate. You can invest, but they also depreciate. So it's pretty simple to understand why age earnings profiles slope up with a human capital model. And you can estimate the degree of, from this you can invest. If this was your picture, then without knowing, you can kind of get an estimate with a little maneuvering of how much is being invested at different points in time. Like initially, this amount would be invested. Later on, you got to be a little more careful because your potential earnings may be higher. So, knowing something about that, how much investment and what it does to your earnings, then you can get an estimate of how much is done here and here, and you add those up. Okay. So it's not quite the area on that triangle that determines the aggregate amount of investment, but you use that triangle to estimate. That's how people have done it to some extent. Looking at what they could be getting, what they are getting, make the difference being the investment they're currently making. And that's fundamentally what's going on. Okay. Now let's take learning by doing. So you might say, and reasonably so, that in many jobs your productivity rises as kind of an automatic byproduct of your work. There's no explicit investment that's being made, you're just working, and that leads to more earning. Those in 301 or 302, when we did learning by doing models for the job, what we're going to be saying now is pretty similar to what we said there. I don't remember where we went into the equilibrium outcomes, but that's what we may have, but we're going to do that now. So some people have said, well, the whole idea that there's a cost to investment is nonsense. There's no cost, you're just getting it automatically. So let's say the model that these people have in mind would be something like this. Maybe this is some alternative W. You take a job with learning by doing, maybe this is your profile, LBD. Start out here, but you get more and more productive as you accumulate experience. So it looks like a free lunch. Well, we know in economics there's no free lunch, right? I mean, that's one lesson we try to teach. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Okay? So you have to find some, but sometimes the cost of the lunch is hidden. Somebody may take you out for lunch and pay for it, but it doesn't make it a free lunch necessarily. Right? So you have to look for where the cost comes. Right? So where's the cost? How do we get cost? Yes.
Maybe the product or the price of the product goes down.
Well, maybe the price of the product goes down, but we don't have any. We're just in the labor market here. But in learning by doing, and in firm learning by doing, that certainly would be relevant. But we don't have that here. But it's the right track. Just apply it to the labor market. How would you apply that to the labor market? Suppose you had two jobs. These two jobs. One job here is no learning, you get a flat earnings profile. The other job, it's just the nature of the job. You learn and you get more productive, and it's competitive system. I mean, I could fill out the analysis, and you earn more.
So then if you were to pick up the price, so like a lot of workers going to that job.
Right, and then you have to look at the market equilibrium. That's what eliminates the free lunch. Everybody would like to be in that better job, right? At that profile, but by going in, they knock the profile down. Instead of getting the wage that one gets in an occupation, the function of how many people are in there and other factors, right? So you have more people coming into the occupation, the marginal productivity goes down, and wages go down. That would be the way the competitive market would operate, and any market, certainly competitive market. So the equilibrium might be something like this. Looks pretty similar to that case, right? Equilibrium. So is there a free lunch? No. No longer a free lunch. You pay for it by taking lower earnings early on, even though everything is automatic. Everything is completely automatic. You get your lower earnings early on, and then your productivity is rising, still rising, so you have to get higher earnings later on, and it can't be pushed down so far that you're never earning more than the other occupation. You would never do it, right? So again, you're discounting present value. The two earning streams should be the same if you have a bunch of identical workers.
How do you differentiate?
Well, it's very difficult to do. If somebody was, you were asking me, suppose there's learning by doing, does that mess us up? I would say no, because we can estimate the cost. I would say, how is the company going to estimate the cost? Well, at least the workers could estimate the cost, because the workers are paying it in this case. I'll come for a moment to the work company. The worker would say the cost is I'm earning lower thing. That's like I'm investing. I'm investing in my future earnings. And from that point of view, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, from that point of view, it doesn't make any difference. Now, if you want to look in detail, you can say, well, Are people going into explicit training programs as opposed to just working and increasing their productivity? That's one way people actually try to separate these two things out. But it's not so easy to do. Okay? So, all investments on the job convert people who have kind of general skills into people with some specialized skill. Now, question, what you mean by specialized? That's going to be answering your question. You can distinguish the different degrees of specialization. You take a narrow degree of specialization, your skills are specific to the firm, sometimes called firm-specific investments. Okay. You familiar with that? Most of you familiar with that? And all it means is what it says. If the investment raises your productivity in this firm, which is any firm, but doesn't raise your productivity in any other firm. A very strong version, but there may be things. You learn the culture of the firm, and maybe, once you go to another firm, you have to learn an entirely different culture. You learn who are the capable people at your firm. Go to another firm, you have to learn. So let's say I be here, I know who are the smart people worth talking to on the faculty, and who are worth avoiding. Right? And in any job, you learn those skills. Those are firm-specific. And so there's firm-specific investment. Now, if it's firm-specific, by definition, it's only useful in the firm. Right, so let me write down various distinctions. Well, why is this pointing outward? You have to add up human capital. Okay, then we can say we have industry specific and occupational specific. And general. And these are all somewhat different. As I said, firm-specific, you raise the productivity only in the firm. Okay. Industry-specific, let's say it's equally useful in all firms in the same industry. So you learn automotive skills, you can apply them at any automobile company. You learn how to teach at a university, you can do it at Chicago, or you can do it at Stanford or any other place. That would be industry specific. Occupational specific, well, you get your training as a doctor, and that's true as long as you stay in medicine. If you take your medical training, you try to become an engineer, it's not going to be very useful to you. So, who pays for the training? Think of that question. Who pays the training? How much do I get? Both are relevant. Who pays for it? Now, in the examples I gave up here, I was assuming that the worker is paying for it. So if the worker can get training that's general, take the last category, general training. The worker gets general training, what happens? Well, the training raises their productivity in all, it doesn't have to be literally all firms, but various industries and various firms. And so and we have a competitive labor market. They'd be bidding for the trained worker, pay that worker his marginal product, right, in a competitive labor market. And so no firm is going to want to pay for that training, right? So perfectly general training, no firm and a competitive labor market, both are important. Perfectly general and a competitive labor market, the worker has to pay for the training. People say, well, how, there was an old literature, just the wrong literature, but there was no literature. It said, look, there's an external, I mean, these bad externality arguments come up constantly. And this was saying, there's an externality, because nobody's going to pay for training of a worker in a competitive industry, because that worker, once they get trained, they'll be bid away by other firms. So this firm that's offering the training is providing an externality to the other firms that are using it. Common argument, sometimes used to justify, infant industry argument, justify protectionism in order to get training. Well, what would be the answer to that? The obvious answer would be that the worker pays for the training. Now, there may be problems with capital markets and so on, so you can go into those. But as much as possible, the worker would end up paying for that training. Yeah.
What happens when the general training is like complementary to the specific training of an industry? In that case, even the company might be willing to pay for general training. So if there's like complementary,
hold that for a moment. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, but hold that. We'll get to that. Once we get the analysis right, we can hold that question. Anything else at this point? All right. So the workers will pay for it. Now, if the worker can't pay for it, then you have a problem. Now, it could be an inefficiency because of capital market increase, but it's not due to the competition. It's not fundamentally due to the competition. Okay. Long-term contracts could solve that, but that could be true in the first case as well. But in principle, the worker will pay for it. There's no externality. All right. So with general training, you think the worker pays for it, and it shows up in lower wages initially, higher wages later on, as in the diagram I gave. Right? The worker pays for it, you get higher earnings later on. Okay? Now let's take the case of industry-specific training. It's useful only to firms in the same industry. It's a competitive industry. Let's start out with two cases. One, it's a competitive industry. You follow me? So what would happen?
I feel like something would happen where the worker pays for it through a decrease in wages and costs.
Why?
Because in an industry-specific, when you're investing in industry-specific skills, you would, another competing firm in the same industry could just bid up your wage because they haven't invested.
Yeah, because the other firms in the industry, they will compete for your services when you're skilled, so you'll be getting your equilibrium marginal product. But if you're getting that, that's not any different as long as there are enough, competitors within the industry. As long as it's a competitive industry, that's not any different than the general training. In that dimension, there will be an important dimension in which they'll be different. Anybody? Anybody has the right answer, I should say. Okay. What do you think?
Well, I mean, if it's an industry-specific skill, then it's riskier to invest in it as a worker. Because I guess it ties to the industry, so at least I didn't like the industry or in bad shape. B, if the industry
All right.
pays.
Yeah, so you may worry about that. Yeah.
Right.
Good. The second point is even more important.
Yeah.
If the industry goes down, the decline of the automobile industry, reduction in employment in the automobile industry, cutting of wages, you just can't go to another industry and expect to get the same pay you were getting before. You'll suffer maybe a big wage cut as you go out. So if you have industry-specific training, one way to test that would be decline in the industry should mean a significantly lower, well, if you have a lot of industry-specific training, should mean a significantly lower wage when you have to work in another industry. And therefore, you'd be willing to stay in that industry at a significantly lower wage if it declines. Okay? With general training, you wouldn't. You just go to another industry. That's the test. That is the test. would be not so easy to distinguish them, but there is a way to distinguish them. How do you distinguish them? Armin, how would you distinguish them?
Distinguish what exactly the industry specific?
You have to speak loud.
Sorry, what exactly to distinguish the industry specific?
Firm specific.
Maybe transition rates between, like whether workers tend to transition more between jobs within an industry or across industries?
Well, I mean, one, you have to look at different things. For example, if a worker has a lot of industry-specific training, if the worker leaves that job, you expect them to go to another firm in the same industry. You have firm-specific training, if you leave, won't make any difference. So decline in an individual firm will have a big effect. You have firm-specific training. It won't have such a big effect, maybe no effect, if you have industry-specific training, as long as you have other firms in the industry that aren't declining. That would be one set of statistics one looks at. And indeed, people look at that when they look at declines in firms, they do find a tendency. I mean, Derek Neal did that in his, basically in his doctoral dissertation. He showed a big tendency when a firm declines. Let's say a firm goes out of business, a lot of the workers tended to find employment in the same industry, suggesting that at least, not that there's no firm-specific investment need, but it's suggesting there's a lot of industry-specific. How would you be able to detect from that whether there's firm-specific investment? So you have a firm that closes down, Lehman Brothers. All right. Many other examples. Firms close down. Now, let's say you find that workers who leave that firm, because it closed down, they have to leave the firm. A lot of them go to, maybe all of them, go to work for firms in the same industry. Can you say there's no firm-specific investment? How would you know? What would you look at? Eric?
What their wages are at the new firms.
What the wages?
Yeah.
Right, if they're earning the same wage as the new firms they got at the old firm, you say then basically it's all industry-specific. If they have to take a big reduction, you say there must have been some significant component, not only firm-specific, but a significant component of firm-specific. Okay. Yeah, firm-specific investment. First, before I take that, so what you had in an industry that was a monopoly. One firm, hiring labor, okay, industry specific. Well, in that case, there's nobody else to go to, and so the firm might be willing to, if it was industry specific, the firm would say, well, you know, I might be, be willing to pay for those cars, because I'll get the benefits. I'm not going to pay them a higher wage subsequently because I'm the only industry that's involved. Okay? Now, the worker who has industry specific may threaten the firm, to leave, but if the worker can only get W someplace else, all the firm would have to pay was W plus epsilon, and the threat wouldn't be credible that they would leave under those conditions, right? So in that case, with a monopolized industry, the firm would have more incentive to pay for it. The worker may still pay for it, depending upon their confidence in the reputation of the firm that they will pay them their marginal product later on. So the worker might still pay for it. Right? Now we take firm specific. Well, if it's firm specific, and I can't write a long-term contract, then there is a similar problem. If the worker pays for it, how does the worker know that they will then get the higher wage later on? Well, if the firm has a history of paying the higher wages for people getting this training, they have their reputation online, they can attract workers because of that, then the worker may pay for it. On the other hand, the firm may say, well, look, it's tough for the worker to pay for it because of capital constraints. I'll pay for it, but I'll be able to collect the return because they don't have anywhere near equal alternatives by leaving. You get a bargaining between the two, but it could be you get some sharing of the training costs. And it could be you get underinvestment because of these potential threats. You don't get the optimal investment. That could be as well. Okay, does that answer what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty much, I just say that
Yeah,
if a worker invests in film specific, he's willingness to pay the cost in a film slowly because.
no question it's lower. No question it's lower. But if he has enough confidence in the firm, he will be willing to do it. You know, firms establish reputations. They're hiring late workers over time. It's a reputational problem of the usual.
He has the risk of that.
I can't, yeah.
He has the risk of that thing goes down.
Well, he has a risk, yeah. He has a risk that the firm may go under, right? He definitely has that risk. Just like in industry, you have the risk the industry goes under. Maybe the firm can bear that risk better than the worker because the firm can diversify over better, more easily than the worker, right? So that would enter into it. Now we have occupational specific. Well, if the occupation is used in a lot of activities, then that's like general training. And you may not stay within the firm, stay within the industry. The work will tend to have to pay for occupational specific training. So interns don't go paid that much, partly because they're learning skills when they're interning in a hospital they can use in any hospital. Now it also may be because of the monopoly power of the cartel of the hospitals, but that's a partly, and I think there's something to that as well. But even without that, you can see why the workers would get lower wages. They would have to bear a lot of the cost of doing this, because as long as they had mobility across hospitals, which they do. Most doctors who intern at a particular hospital end up generally working at another hospital. They don't stay with the same hospital. So when a university, as they say, attracts an assistant professor to a top university department, let's say economics, Chicago, one said, well, we don't have to pay you. Maybe a not so good university is offering you more, but you're going to learn a lot here, you'll get a better job later on. So you should be taking a lower wage. Right? It doesn't always work. But it should work more than it does work, I think. Because you are investing, and it does make a difference. And you spend a year at Harvard, or, a few years as assistant professor at Harvard or Chicago or Stanford, MIT, and you end up usually getting a pretty good position later on, even if you didn't quite make it the place where you started. And it makes a big difference if you started at, let's say, Ohio State, which is a pretty good department, but not one of the top departments. Then, if you don't get tenure there, it's going to be harder. Now, you may not be as good, so you have to sort that problem out. But you do learn more the better department. You learn how to do research, etc. No, not a direct, you can look at, sort of estimate the type of training involved from two different types of statistics. You look at wages, which we discussed, or you can look at turnover. So what you observe in the data is that turnover of workers is very heavy in the first 2 or 3, basically highest in the first 6 months. Turnover of workers from a firm is very heavy early on in their experience at a firm, and is much less later on. And similarly for industry turnover. As somebody said, you may try an industry, you don't like it, you move to another industry. But after a while, you're likely to stay in the same industry. So turnover is relevant. Regardless of who pays for the costs, let's say that firm-specific investment, regardless of who's paying for it, the efficient, if you think the outcome is efficient in the labor market, The efficient outcome should be the worker stays with the firm. I mean, other things are saying the firm doesn't go bankrupt and all that. I invest a lot of my training at this firm. Okay, we have some workouts in combination, but by definition, my marginal productivity is higher at this firm than elsewhere. So the equilibrium, if we think the equilibrium is efficient, this firm should stay, the worker should stay at this firm. This firm should hold on to this worker. That's the efficient outcome. So, I mean, I've thought the idea of quits and separation, that's the wrong way to think about this problem. I mean, quits and layoffs. It's separations that counts, and you get separation when it's no longer efficient to stay at the same relationship. And the same thing would be true for industry specific. It's more efficient to stay in the same industry, so if the outcome is efficient, you would think in the competitive labor market you would tend to get efficient outcome. You stay in that industry. Unless you're pushed out because the industry goes way down. So that's how you should think about the labor market outcomes. You know, who's going to pay it will affect the shape of the wage profile, no question about it. But you have this other implication about turnover. Should be very robust. Turnover should be very robust. If I'm not turning over much from a firm, that means it's something firm specific. Not turning over much from industry, it means it's something industry specific. It's not only for labor, it's also for suppliers, and a whole supply chain, including the labor market. The same suppliers are supplying a particular industry mean there must be, let's say they're supplying capital. The capital must be specific to that industry. I'm stamping out automobile body parts. That's the automobile industry, right? Now I want to use this analysis in a different direction. To look at it as some kind of aggregate labor specialization. So I indicated workers become more different as they age. It's very systematic, but it also depends on the economy's needs and technological possibilities. So the way now I want you to begin to think about this is an economy-wide division of labor. Specialization. Some people specialize in occupation A, some people specialize in industry B, some people specialize in firm C, and so on. Some people have general skills who can move across industries. And then the question we come to ask, well, what determines this equilibrium outcome? Workers may start out with different abilities, cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. They may produce differences by investment. And so what kind of equilibrium do you get when you look at the combination of the different investments they produce, maybe the different talents that they have, and the different needs of the economy? That's the big question. I'm going to reduce it to more manageable proportions. All right? And the basic thing that's going to drive a lot of the analysis, and I'll just mention a few things and then we'll finish. The basic thing that's going to drive the analysis is that investments in human capital are an increasing returns to scale activity. So, one, increase in returns to scale. That implies specialization. So if you have increasing returns to scale, people are going to be into specialized. Because it's more efficient to do one thing or a small set of things than to do everything. But people are going to have to specialize in different ways if you want to produce what the economy is demanding. So they're going to be different. They're going to produce differences. They're going to look very different. Even though they may start out looking very much the same. Indeed, I'm going to mainly deal with a model where everybody's ex ante identical. The Adam Smith model. And then show that you get this specialization in divisional labor as a result of the incentive to specialize. So that's what we'll start on next Tuesday.